Welcome to Unaka City in the year 1951, an important year from an urbanist's perspective. The first pre-interstate highways are funded, but not built. The success of Levittown outside of New York City has put a twinkle in the eyes of real estate developers. 1/3 of all people own cars, and this is the last year the streetcars will run before being replaced by buses or be abandoned, depending on the line. So before everything goes to hell, let's look at our starting point. Located in Watauga County, South Watauga was founded to be the southern center of the state of Franklin. When that didn't pan out, the settlers who founded it went back to their old habits, squatting on Cherokee land. Let's take a look at the city. It's your standard pre-interstate, pre-white flight American city with a downtown full of mid-rise development, offices, apartments, warehouses, and department stores. On the west side of town, there's the Union Terminal and heavy industry with numerous rail spurs serving individual manufacturing plants. A web of steel and wires spin out from downtown, and with them, commercial corridors and walkable, moderately dense suburban neighborhoods. These first-order suburbs also contain the largest hospital in town, universities, and even light manufacturing. This pattern is repeated throughout the satellite towns of Hadestown, Clinton, Knoxburg, and Blair, just at different scales. All of this good urban development was built around rails. The downtown centered on the first rail station in town, and the surrounding neighborhoods based on streetcars. Getting into the first topic that I plan on covering is a summarized history of the private rail and streetcar operations. The first railroad that came to town was the Charlotte and Western, sold as a gateway for claims on the riches of the mountains to investors. The 5-foot broad gauge railroad was built with slave labor from Charlotte to South Watauga, and promptly went bankrupt. A second state-sponsored, slave-built standard gauge railway was built from South Watauga to Spartanburg, and the discovery of ore ensured that both passengers and cargo would flow. After the war, it would be several decades before any more investment would come, but eventually convicts and Northern financing would build railroads out in 3 directions, to Asheville, Statesville, and a cocaine and absinthe-fueled line to Chattanooga. So many tracks were being laid that they ran out of convicts and had to actually pay people. Oh yeah, I should probably mention that most of this labor was done by prisoners. 7 in 8 were black, and all were arrested for nonviolent crimes, such as theft, failure to pay debts, or loitering. After federal troops pulled out of southern states, they did not even wait for the ink to dry to start flaunting the Reconstruction Amendments. Fast forward several years. Around the turn of the century, business leaders got together and built the Unaka Union Terminal and consolidated most travel into the city. There was direct service to New Orleans, Louisville, Atlanta, and D.C. With a transfer, you could get anywhere in the country. Also, there were limited commuting opportunities. For the purposes of Unaka City, let's say that the trains passing through the small towns offered passes that you could use like a commuter service, but it wasn't perfect, and that the only dedicated service was between Hadestown and Unaka City. This leads to the next transportation topic, streetcars. While you can catch a train from the town of Clinton to Unaka City, most people instead took the interurban. Interurbans are streetcars that do exactly what it says on the tin. It's a streetcar in between cities, urban. These were very popular in the North and particularly in the Midwest, but were not that common in the South, and they were very rare in southern Appalachia. I could only find record of one in a town in the heart of Appalachia, but I don't know if connecting Bristol, Tennessee to Bristol, Virginia really counts. Otherwise, some in Nashville and Atlanta, and the very fun story of the Piedmont and Northern. They ran trolleys from Greenville, South Carolina up to Spartanburg and to near Charlotte. Then they bought a company over in Raleigh-Durham. By this time, they were actually already quite profitable because in addition to passengers, they would move freight right down residential streets. An electric freight train right in your doorstep. The neighbors certainly loved it. They tried to connect their 2 sections through Charlotte and North Carolina, but were denied by the ICC. They then appealed, saying that they're an interurban. We're not a normal company. Well, in a rare moment of courts not taking what assholes say at face value, they were denied due to the fact that 90% of their revenue came from freight, so calling themselves an interurban was rather disingenuous. They switched over to diesels anyways, so whatever. Our interurban is based on the one in Nashville, as it connects from the Clinton Town Square to near downtown. Riders do have to transfer to other systems, though, So that inconvenience led to this interurban never being as popular as hoped. In Unaka City, meanwhile, similar relics of the past are providing transportation. For a more in-depth look at streetcars in American cities, you've got a lot of options, but I recommend this video by Big Mood Energy and her research partner, Javier. I will just tell the story of Unaka City, which will mix and match the history from Nashville, Chattanooga, and Charlotte. Are you sure this thing's on? Whenever you are ready, Mr. Gordon. So my memory of the streetcar, well, Mama will give me a nickel. Will send me down to the library for some learning. Some days I just buy me a soda pop and I'd walk instead. What was the nickel for? To ride the trolley. The fare was a nickel. What other memories do you have? Well, me and some of the other boys in the neighborhood, we'd try and collect trolleys. We try and switch the tracks the wrong direction. I remember James got full one day. Oh boy, they were popping. The streetcar system is the story of two houses, both alike in dignity, who built streetcars for very different reasons and would sometimes cooperate and would often clash. The first streetcar line was from the under-construction Union Terminal to the Eastern Manufacturing District and was built by the UC Power Co-op as a way to both bring workers to two of the small power plants that they operated and as a benefit to those members of the co-op. The second line went from that station to the south, leading into brand new residential developments built by Mr. Eric Johnson. These two forces would compete to both develop and run the city for nearly 50 years. They only agreed on two things. Number one, that all streetcars should start on the block surrounding Dogwood Park, and that streetcars should be segregated. This last point came to a head as the black population rose from a few hundred to a few thousand. After campaigning by the KKK, Daughters of the Confederacy, and the Southern Baptist and Southern Methodist churches, the mayor ordered the streetcars segregated, something that they were going to do anyways. The black community, of course, was not happy, and after meeting with the mayor, had no effect. Black business leaders had an idea to build their own streetcar system. So they scraped together enough money to lay tracks from the primary black neighborhood into downtown and the industrial district, where many in the community worked. The old coal-powered streetcars that they bought were slow, loud, and polluting. But they got them where they needed to go. After 2 years of operation and a wider boycott, the streetcars were integrated. The UCPC bought out the black streetcar and replaced it with an electric trolley. Fast forward to 1951, the system is in rough shape. Tracks and wires are only maintained after sections break, cause derailments, power loss, or fires. Both companies were operating trolleys built in the 1920s and last refurbished using federal funds in the war. The fact that streetcars are still running at all is mostly a stubborn game of chicken between Johnson's traction company and the UCPC. Both want to be able to claim that their company lasted longer. A deal is worked out so that at the stroke of midnight, 1952, the city of Unaka City will buy out both transit companies for $1 each and will assume the operations and will make any decisions on whether to transfer to bus services or keep them as streetcars. Spoilers, they're all going to be transferred to buses. But a combination of last-minute bribes, threats, and one seduction meant that Johnson's Traction Company was sold for $2. A big dick move that results in scandal and a 15-year legal fight. Aside from running public transportation, the UCPC and Eric Johnson have main businesses. We will start with the UCPC and look at how electricity came to the region. Now, don't expect anything too technical from me, as I'm a civil engineer, not an electrical engineer, so electricity is basically black magic to me, but I do understand two things. Number one, spin turbine to make power, and number two, economies of scale. The first sources of electricity in Unaka City were renewable and were green, for a given definition of green. Hydroelectricity. The river valleys of East Tennessee and western North Carolina were ideal places for hydroelectric dams to be built. There is a reason that East Tennessee was the focus of the largest public utility in the nation. But the first hydroelectric dams were not sufficient for the needs of the rapidly growing and industrializing city, so a second system was built. This system was that of smaller power plants, a coal-fired plant that would power a factory, or a neighborhood, or a college campus. This system was, well, bad and dumb in retrospect. These inefficient and expensive plants would only last for about 20 years before being replaced by larger plants that centralized power distribution thus making the price per kilowatt hour significantly cheaper. Though, with the Tennessee Valley Authority coming in, most of this would be rendered irrelevant, as the federal government would do something good, actually. Additionally, future sources of power would be even more efficient. As for Johnson's businesses, he used land. This is my smooth as butter transition into the land use topic. I am preparing my award acceptance speech now. To discuss land use in Unaka City, we have to go over two seemingly unrelated, but actually deeply connected topics: RICO distribution and density, and then segregation. I'll start with RICO. It is more than just a mod. It's a method of zoning roughly based from the SZEA, a document created by the Coolidge administration with future President Herbert Hoover. It is his contribution to the field of urban planning that led to towns in the 1930s abruptly being renamed Hoovervilles. This document laid out that cities should regulate and restrict the location and use of land for trade, industry, residence, or other purposes. These suggested regulations were an expansion of earlier codes, which were primarily about regulating the location of dangerous or odorous industries. Before these regulations, it kinda was the Wild West. Want to build a banana store? Cool. Want to build a banana warehouse? Sure. Want to build a banana-shaped house? All right. Unless the deed of the property prohibited you from specific actions, you could do most anything. Now, these deeds specifying certain land uses were relatively common, particularly in the streetcar suburbs that Eric Johnson developed. But in Unaka City, this manifests in an extremely mixed-use downtown, full of apartments, offices, department stores, warehouses, and institutions. Along the streetcar lines, this results in commerce and apartments on the main street itself, and narrow lots with homes taking up a decent chunk of the area, the so-called streetcar suburbs. But after Ziza and the Supreme Court case Euclid versus Amber Realty that made it constitutional, this kind of development was made illegal. But it was up to each town and city to adopt these, and Unaka City took its time. We'll say by 1936. However, Unaka City did adopt an earlier zoning code, just not one about density. This code reflects the difficult history of black communities in South Appalachia's cities. Many who could escape the sharecropping system but could not manage to leave the South sought opportunity in the growing urban center of Unaka City. On a hill north of town, the first black community grew. First homes, then streets, then institutions. But the dark side of this community was the confinement, because while whites were happy to have blacks work for them, they were not happy to have them as neighbors. And through violence and copying a page from Atlanta's book, A Racial Zoning Code, the races were segregated. This code was blatantly illegal with 2 separate Supreme Court decisions as precedent, but it took 3 years for lawyers to repeal it in a somewhat limited win for human dignity. The city then instead encouraged racial covenants in property, strategically placed segregated schools and other Jim Crow institutions in black areas, and implemented the Euclidean zoning code. This is where the zoning and segregation intertwined. Knowing that black people primarily rented and had lower incomes than whites, the 1936 code sought to prevent smaller units, more affordable densities, and apartments from being built in middle-class neighborhoods. Unfortunately, the segregation in this code would only be amplified in the coming years, and the federal government would turn this up to 11. The primary method that the federal government contributed to segregation was in redlining. As a part of FDR's New Deal recovery program, the Homeowners Loan Corporation regulated and restructured the mortgage sector, and by extension, the real estate market of America. One of the tools they used were residential security maps they made of every major U.S. city. I will only look at the redlining found in Unaka City, but there are resources that cover the topic with far more dignity and research than I am capable of. We will look at 2 neighborhoods, the Johnson District, colored blue, one of Eric Johnson's streetcar suburbs, which he humbly named, and the previously mentioned North Hill, which is red, the primary black community in town. Before we listen to the federal comments, I want to stress that these are actually very similar neighborhoods. Both have schools and retail, both have streetcar access, and both have homes of wealth. There is one key difference that the federal government highlights. Johnson District. This area consists of the Johnson District. It is rolling to hilly, thickly wooded, lots are wide, schools and churches are located in the area. There is quite an extensive community business center on Brainerd Road. Brainerd Road is dotted with tourist homes, filling stations, taverns, and is gradually going to business, although there are some very substantial homes located on it, but mostly towards the eastern end. Area has all utilities and adequate transportation by streetcar. The East Riverside section is all outside the city limits, and while it has all utilities and adequate transportation, type of construction is not as substantial as in the remainder of the area. And it is this part of the area that the lower period properties are located and the lower income group of people live. Area as a whole is about 75% improved. Shifting or infiltration? None. Foreign families? 0%. Negro? 0%. North Hill. Part of the area north of Broad is all Negro. Some better Negro properties on 5th Street off Central Avenue. Remainder of this part contains all kinds of properties, with the bad predominating. Negro Park at the northern corner of the area. Railroad yards from the east boundary, and noise and smoke is a nuisance. In that part of the area south of Macaulay, whites live in about 4 blocks from western side of 8th, and Negroes in other part of 8th to Central Avenue. The principal Negro business district of the city is located on North Street. It is a mixed area of old houses, mixed population, poor maintenance, contour from rolling to hilly, and about the only thing in its favor is it is within easy walking distance of the main business center. Schools, churches, and stores are located in the area. Sales activity almost exclusively in Negro properties. Shifting or infiltration, 0. Foreign families, 0%. Negro, 80%. So did you spot the difference? These reports and maps would lead to decades of disinvestment, as money and capital would be directed away from the red and yellow neighborhoods, resulting in poor upkeep, financial vultures, and sometimes even abandonment. Also, prices will tank, which, as we will see next episode, has knock-on effects. In 50 or so years, these neighborhoods will recover as money and culture shift, though not all will benefit. But it's important to keep in mind that the segregation, urban decay, and other problems that echo from the past stem from deliberate policy decisions. Alright, so that's about 150 years of history summed up in 19 minutes. Next episode will be about a considerably shorter period of time as we go over the back half of the 20th century and the effect that it had on Unaka City and other cities in America. After that, we will then move on to the future as we look to make Unaka City into a great city.